2, 1. Good evening, everyone, and welcome back. I'm Professor Jeanette Moritz, and I will be doing part 2 of doing your literature review. Last night we had a session and we had quite a lot of theory. We had some practical tips and advice, so I hope by tonight you know at least where to start. So for tonight, we're continuing with our journey through constructing and doing and writing up our literature review. So I hope you're all warm, and we'll be spending the next 2 hours together. All right, as you might remember, at the end of last night's session, we left with a short exercise to do. I hope you engaged in that and that you had fun with it. Can I ask that you maybe post your ideas around the exercise and reviewing the abstract, and also being able to evaluate the journal and the abstract itself and the usefulness potentially for your literature review or any gaps that you might have identified. So you are welcome to put that in the question and answer section. Also the questions that you might have as we carry on or that you might have thought about in the meantime. And then we will have, I think, a nice discussion at the end of the session. All right, then we're going to start with tonight's session. I hope you have a lot of fun. Right, so let's have a look. Last night we ended with the exercise, as I mentioned, and so this is what I'm referring to in terms of what you can comment on as you did engaged with the exercise last night, and then we'll have a chat about this afterwards. So I just want to do a quick review and a recap on what we did last night. Last night we talked about the steps of your literature review. We're quickly going to talk about design, to conduct and analyze and structuring and writing the review. But there's also a source for you that you could read about these components. So we started talking about designing your review, and in the design phase, we start asking the questions. Who is the potential audience of this review? The potential audience could be, when you write your proposal, that your audience would be the reviewers or the ethics committee. When you start writing on your chapters, you might be writing for the examiner, and the examiner will be your reviewer. If you start writing articles, then your potential audience is the journal editors and the journal reviewers, and ultimately your audience that reaches your work through the journals and publication. So at different stages, you might be writing for a different audience. So please keep that in mind when you are busy with your review and writing up. We also talked about that you need to have a specific purpose and a research question that your review will be addressing. In this design phase, we asked the question, what's the appropriate method to use to meet this objective of the review? And we briefly spoke about different types of literature reviews, such as the traditional review, scoping reviews, rapid reviews, systematic reviews, meta-analysis. There's quite a number. We also talked about formulating your search terms, your inclusion and exclusion criteria, and identifying databases or search engines that you're going to approach. So that's all in the design and planning phase. When we get to actually conducting this, the review, we need to ask ourselves, does the plan in stage 1, will it produce the results required, or does it need amendments? And you might find that you make amendments as you go along. There might be new work emerging, or you find new connections, or you discover new questions, and that might need some amendment. You make your document decisions, your key terms, processes, and results for an audit trail. So remember last night I said, you document every single step that you do. You document what is your question, you document your search engines, you document the keywords or combinations of keywords that you use with every search. You can also document the number of hits you get, and you record those so that if there's an audit trail, you can follow the audit trail and they would get to the same documents or conclusions that you might get to. And then definitely throughout your review, you will be asking yourself, how will the quality be ensured, and also how is quality maintained? So we spoke about the quality of the journals. We spoke about the quality of your search. We spoke about thought leaders, key authors, and there were different steps that you could ensure that you have a quality literature review. Remember, we started the session by saying GIGO, garbage in, garbage out. So we want to make sure we have quality reviews. So last night I stopped and we said we will talk in this session a bit more about the analysis. And we'll also talk about then the rest of this session about writing up some things that you can pay attention to as you do your literature review. So when we talk about analyzing our literature, once you've identified your different journal articles or from different sources, you've established that. You would first skim through, for instance, the abstracts or the first lines, first paragraphs. I usually read the abstract, I read the discussion of the findings, and I read the conclusion, which I always find very useful, because in the conclusion section, you will usually find that that's where the authors tell you what are future recommendations, or what are other aspects that can be investigated further, and that might be helpful for your research. So when we analyze, we need to decide what type of information need to be abstracted to fulfill the purpose of the review. You will be analyzing not only within an article or within a body of work, but you'll also be analyzing between works. So you will be looking between your sources and your articles and your books. And in order to do that, you need to compare and contrast. So compare and contrast are higher order thinking skills. When we say compare, we mean that what is similar? What is similar in the one article's findings to the other article's findings, for instance? Or what is similar in the design? Or what is similar in the results? Or you might find contrasts. You might find that things are different between sources. Their focus might be different. They might be using different concepts. They might be using different conceptual frameworks. They might have different results, or they might add and have different arguments from which they depart. So as you analyze, you will intensify your search, your writings, and by that we mean your reading becomes more focused. So when we're doing our literature review in different stages, our initial reading of literature might be quite broad to get a sense of what is the playing field. But as we get to your literature review chapter, our reading becomes much more focused. Then we start to borrow concepts of intrinsic value, or we might look for deviant cases, we might look for relationships, we might identify new concepts, new constructs. So it is always a process that grows. Remember last night we said it's not a linear process. So you can think, oh, I've done all my searches, I'm now ready to do my analysis. And then you find a deviant case. And that might cause you to go and search further or look for other cases that is maybe similar or different. And it's very useful, I find it very useful to use mind maps. And a mind map, we'll get to a picture of a mind map in the meantime, but that's simply making a map. You can do a visual map, you can do it on paper, you can do it on your computer, but how do you maybe view the constructs, or what are you reading? Have you identified themes? And you can make your linkages, or if you use post-it notes, you can move them around so that the visualization becomes apparent. If you've got a mind map, I usually find that it's easier to write up. Whereas if you write up from the beginning, you might find it's difficult to move information around as your thoughts maybe change, or if you find new or other connections. So when we talk about analyzing the literature, we're also working with data. And the data that we have is similar to qualitative data. We've got text. When we do qualitative interviews, we transcribe them and we end up with text. So we follow a similar process as we would analyze qualitative text. Or so and it's very general steps. So we usually first read to get a sense of the whole. Now you might do a quick read, or you might do a deep read. Quick read, you might just read through the abstracts, and like I do, I read the abstracts. If I find, okay, there seems to be something that's worthwhile, I might go to the results, I might go to the conclusion or recommendations, or depending what I think this article is useful for. With your second read, you now start to jot down main ideas. You can do it if you're still working with pen and paper, you can do it on the paper. However, we've moved to a paperless society by and large. But it's very easy when you have a PDF that you can make comments, you can have post-it notes, the same as you would have on paper. In that, you can jot down any thoughts you have, any connections that you're already making. You can jot down methodological notes. You can jot down any feelings that you have. You know, I often make very emotive notes that this makes me uneasy, or wow, this is amazing. My notes are quite extensive, and doesn't necessarily always have to be actual notes about the paper. But I always, when I'm busy reading an article and I need to stop, I make a note about that too, so that, and I would say, okay, I've stopped here. This is my final thoughts. When I read the paper further tomorrow, I need to consider this, that, and the other. Now that's useful, that when you do engage with the article again, that you know where your thoughts were, and you don't have to start rereading everything to catch up and think, oh, where were I? So I find even when I write up and I need to stop my writing, I make a note for myself. I'm here now. When I work with the article again, or with the review again, I need to look at the following. And that just helps me to connect when there's a pause between my reading and my writing. So when you've got some main ideas, you might find that soon enough you'll be able to group the ideas in categories or subcategories, and eventually you would be able to identify themes. So a theme is simply a number of categories that forms a theme. and I'll give you an idea about that just now. So you can also ask Atlas TI to do a summary for you, or otherwise, if you're doing your literature review using Atlas TI, for instance, you can, as I showed you last night, you have the whole article in front of you. You can make notes. You can also jot down ideas, and you can start making comparisons between articles. So when reading critically, keep in mind the purpose of your literature review. I don't know if you're anything like me, but I get distracted easily. I often find a very juicy article, and then I go astray. I then follow the juiciness. And before long, I've completely strayed away in terms of my focus reading. So I often have a post-it note with the purpose either of my research, my purpose of my paper, or the purpose of the literature review stuck up somewhere, so that whenever I look up, I can read, this is my purpose. I need to rein myself in. I'm going walkabout. So think about what you expect from the article or chapter before reading. As I said, you can skim read the abstract, headings, conclusion, first sentences, and then very important, focus on the argument presented rather than the facts. We definitely need the facts for when we write our background, for our problem statements. But as we do deeper reading, we are often more enticed by the arguments, counter-arguments, discourses in the field, and that can also lead you to a higher level of thinking. So you can ask yourself about the relevance of the article. Is the article relevant to your study? Is it current? Remember, we spoke about currency last night. Does it consider the latest research on the topic? Are there any biases where you find that the previous research was biased, or the researchers themselves had some biases? And then, very important, read for the accuracy. Does the data support the conclusion? Now, these are very good criteria for yourself when you evaluate yourself and your own literature review. So when you would look at your own literature review, ask these same questions, not only about the articles that you are looking at, but also when you write your own literature review, you can use the same criteria to self-evaluate. So we spoke about mind mapping. So mind map is simply a tool for the brain to capture the thinking that goes on inside your head. And if you're anything like me, sometimes there's just too much going on in my head. So I stood up at 3 this morning because I couldn't sleep, and I just needed to get out of my head everything that was going on so that I could continue sleeping. But a mind map might look something like, you might be looking at virtual communities of practice, and you might have found there are a number of themes. There's a theme with using technology, where virtual communities of practice were founded on, what it constitutes, what's the essential features. Now, those might be broad categories or themes, and then you might list the codes or the categories that, say, for instance, when you look at virtual communities of practice, where it was founded on, you might have sub categories such as constructivist learning. It involves observing, modeling, interacting, engaging, and thinking together. And that might bring you to your main phenomena, which is maybe coaching supervision. So this is a typical mind map that you can start putting together as you read and as you identify themes in your reading or discourses. And you might want to present this type of a mind map, or sometimes you end up with a conceptual map by the end of your review that you can also then use to help the reader and help them guide them through your literature review. So I think in the article that I referred you to last night, they wrote up the methods very, very well. Or this might just be a methods that I got from another journal. Remember, we said that your literature review has the same format as your proposal or your actual thesis or dissertation. It has the planning, it has the purpose, it has a research question, it has your methodology and your methods that you used. So this is a very nice example when you write up your literature review in your introduction section. You can orientate the reader with something like this. The first two authors independently conducted literature searches via Google Scholar to find reviews that appeared from 2019 to July 2021. So there you can see the 5 years that they chose. That was an inclusion criteria. And they combined four sets of search terms that corresponded with the inclusion criteria. There you can see the terms that they used, or collection of terms, so they're quite explicit. And another criteria was that the studies had to be published reviews that focused on SMUs, mental health, and adolescence. So there's the criteria for the inclusion criteria. They only used Google Scholar. So I'll be a bit worried about that, as is the only search engine. I would have hoped to see other search engines as well. But they give you the time frame, they give you the combination of search terms that they use. They could have, for instance, also, if they wanted to tell you the number of hits that they got with each of these terms, but in this case they didn't. And then they carry on with their inclusion criteria. So that's just an idea that you can use when you write up your literature review. So now we're going to carry on with the second part of our discussion tonight, and that's specifically focusing on how do we write up and the common problems and challenges that we might have when writing up our review. So we've now planned it, we have identified our sources, we have analysed our literature in whatever form they might be, and now we are ready to start writing up our literature review. So in some sense, I think we have talked about it throughout, because there's a sense of writing while you're doing the literature review. So I often find that it's not necessarily in separate phases. You write as you read and you read as you write. But just in terms of going for a logical pathway, yeah, we'll be looking at writing up next, and then we'll chat about common problems and challenges. So the big idea when you start writing up your literature review is that you are telling the story to the reader or to your audience. So it must be an interesting read. Very often, I must say, when I evaluate a dissertation or a thesis, or I examine the literature review chapters, are usually such a bore. I want to die. Reading through 25 or 30 or sometimes 40 pages of literature, it's just excruciatingly boring for me. So try and keep your reader engaged. Now, one way to do that is to help them through the story. It's similar to, you by now know I like metaphors. So I always think, when you take a little child and you start walking, you tell the child, oh, we're going to walk through the woods today. And this is what the woods will be looking like. You can tell them we're going to have some trees, and there might be some paths, and when we go along this path, you might find birds. and this path you might find some water. So you kind of leading them in the way and preparing them what they might find. And similar, when you tell a story, you would like your reader to be enticed. They must want to read. You must try and make it easy for them, and keep the story scientific, but enjoyable read. So I know sometimes when you just work with facts that you quickly become saturated. So I often find that I can't evaluate a literature review in one sitting because it takes me more than 20 minutes to read, and my concentration is only 20 minutes, so I need to take a break or do it in more than one session. But it always helps to have a storytelling disposition when you start writing. Now, the Michigan publishing of the University of Michigan Press, you can have a look at where you could find the URL, and they talk about writing a literature review by telling a research story. So you might get some useful information about story writing as well. Don't ask me why I've got the little sad face and the phone and the toilet. I can't remember what I had associated that at some stage. I must maybe remove it. I can't remember what the idea was. Sorry for that. So when you're writing the review, the motivation and the need for the review must be clearly communicated. By that, we are telling the reader, why are we doing the literature review? It links with a purpose. What's the question, for instance, that we're trying to answer? So prepare the reader. And depending on the approach, the final review article or your chapter can be structured in different ways, and it will require different types of information and different levels of detail. You might also find when you do systematic reviews or integrative reviews in a doctoral study, that there are certain criteria for writing up a systematic review, and that's the PRISMA criteria. And then for integrative reviews, there's the Ramses. And it gives you the key information that you need to write, and also the order of presenting it. Now, the PRISMA for scoping reviews, for instance, you can read about that. That checklist contains 20 essential reporting items. So if you say you are doing a scoping review and you want to get it published, they will have a checklist, and you need to make sure that you answer all the 20 essential reporting items. And there are 2 optional items to include when completing a scoping review. So scoping reviews serve to synthesize evidence and to assess the scope of literature on a topic. Like I said last night, a scoping review might be useful on a master's level, or on a PhD level. You might do a scoping review to assess the scope of a literature, and then decide that maybe the scope is broad enough and that you can continue with a systematic review or an integrated review. So among other objectives, the scoping reviews help to determine whether a systematic review of the literature is warranted. So please, if you are considering scoping reviews, I've put the URL down for you, but even if you're not, it's useful to have a look what are the different items that is required when writing this type of a review. And then also we've got the Ramses for integrated reviews. It is also a checklist. So when we start out with writing anything, whether it's a chapter, whether it's an article, whether it's your dissertation as large, we also always have the same outline. There's always an introduction, there's always a main body, and there's always a conclusion. So if you imagine your thesis, or your dissertation. Your introduction would be your chapter 1. Your main body will be your literature review and your methods and your findings, and then you have a conclusion. So your chapters go according to this outline. If you're doing your proposal, it has the same outline. If you do your literature review write-up, you will have an introduction, a main body, and a conclusion. Your introduction will typically be, like I mentioned earlier on, your sources consulted, the amount of existing work, structures and purpose of the review, and contextualizing the elements of the review. Then you go over to the main body, and this is your main write-up. You now start writing up your themes that you found, your concepts, your discourses, critiquing existing works or theories. In a quantitative study, you might start with the dependent variables and their relationships. Or if you are writing in terms of main themes that you picked up, like we had in the mind map, this would become your main body. And then there's always a conclusion. You could also look at this outline as a macro argument. When we talk about an argument has three aspects. There's a statement, there's the evidence to support a statement, and there's a conclusion. So you can't reach a conclusion if you don't have a statement that you either want to prove or disprove, or have the evidence to do so. So your literature review is very similar to an argumentative type of writing. And you need to reach a conclusion. So by the end of your literature review, you need to give the main summaries of main arguments, disagreements in the literature, any gaps or ideas for future research, and your overall perspective on the topic. Then very important, also then situate yourself within this gap. So tell the reader, after doing all of this work, where will your work be situated? Because that's part of the reason why you are arguing for your research to be done. And remember, we said we need to identify a gap in research, and our study then aims to fill that gap. It might be a theoretical gap, it might be a knowledge gap, it might be a practice gap, it might be a methodological gap, or it can be all of those. But we start identifying the gap when we start finishing up our literature review to motivate and justify where our study will be situated in. So when writing, very, very important is to paraphrase. And to paraphrase meaning that you use your own original words to restate information without losing the meaning of the original text. So please refrain from reams and reams of direct quotes in inverted commas. You will find everything now at UNISA goes through Turnitin. It's not a plagiarism checker. It looks at similarities between your work and other works. And I can promise you, if you have direct quotes, your similarity index will be sky high. So what we want higher order thinking. We don't just want to put down other people's ideas without critically going about those ideas, those facts, those discourses, or those arguments. So you want to look at the information that you are provided with and paraphrase it using your own original words to restate information. Now, that doesn't mean that you just pick the main concepts in the sentence and you right-click and find similar synonyms. and then think it's paraphrasing. It has to still have meaning, and it needs to, even though it's paraphrased, still align with the original meaning of the authors. Now, I must tell you something very interesting that once happened with me when I wrote an article, and I didn't expect that one of the reviews would be someone that I quoted in my article. So when I got the feedback, the author that I quoted wrote a little note by saying, no, that wasn't what the author meant. And I felt very, very embarrassed. So please make sure that you keep the original meaning that the researcher stated. When you summarize, you focus less on the individual message and more on the main message of the source. Also use your reporting verbs. You can Google high frequency reporting verbs. So refrain from just saying Manson said, Dickoff said, Johnson said. Please just mix it up a bit and use different reporting verbs like say, suggest, argue, claim, point out, think, find, report, identify, indicate, show, propose, describe, discuss, give, develop. There's many. So please just don't say they said or argue and use it every time. The other caveat is just please use the correct verb. So if someone didn't argue, then don't use the word they argued something if what you are paraphrasing isn't an argument. But please improve your vocabulary when you start writing up and reporting by using reporting verbs. There's many more, you can Google them, but these are just a few to get you going. So I wanted to show you just the example of an abstract introduction. And then you might see, you know, what they start with, where they start telling the reader. So they make a statement. Remember, just now we said you start with a statement. The statement is higher education aims for university students to produce knowledge from the critical reflection of scientific text. Okay, that's their statement. Now they go to their argument, therefore, developing a deep mental representation of written information is necessary. Yeah, they state their objectives. The objective of this research was to determine through a systematic review and a meta-analysis the proportion of university students that have an optimal performance at each level of reading comprehension. So yeah, they tell you what type of review they did. They did a systematic review, and then the type of analysis, they did a meta-analysis. Then they have their inclusion criteria. Studies have been limited from 2010 to March 2021, and they've got some more search engines like the Web of Science, Scopus, Medline, and PsycInfo. They also say that they had 2 reviews perform the data extraction independently. A random effects model of propositions was used for the meta-analysis, and heterogeneity was assessed with 12. So that's all part of the method. Then they tell you about the micro regression that was used to analyze the influence of moderating variables, and 2 ways were used to study publication bias. Now they tell you what they found. So they found 7 articles that met that criteria and that they included, and those they give you the evidence. It was 12. And now they are telling you they compared the reading and comprehension levels, and this is their findings. And they tell you also there's a caveat, the results have to be interpreted with caution, but are a guide for future research. So that's a very nice introduction where they've actually put everything that is needed in terms of how they went about doing their literature review, and also their findings and a caution. So that would be an abstract or maybe an introduction. So some generalizations. We need to be transparent. So like we've said since last night, we need to be transparent with the process of designing the review, the method for collecting the literature, how the literature was identified, analyzed, and very importantly, synthesized. Remember last night we said we synthesize to bring it together to a new whole. So we take eggs, we beat them, and then we have something new like our omelette or scrambled eggs. Okay, and then very, very important, your organization needs to be coherent. So there must be a logical coherence concerning the approach and the research question. And I think that's maybe the thing that often disturbs me the most when I read or examine a literature review is when the structuring and the arguments isn't coherent. So when we talk about writing up, we want a flow. The flow must be coherent. There mustn't be any frights for the reader as they walk through the woods that suddenly something appears that was never stated before or argued before, for instance. So just as you would organize a drawer, so you need to organize and make sure that there is a logical coherence in your literature review. And that's why I say the mind maps are so useful, because you can check, does your mind map make sense? Do you need to move ideas around? Is there a logical flow? Does the one idea link with the other idea? And just a note, when we talk about writing in general, we talk about that you have a macro argument and you have a micro argument. Now, your macro argument is simply the headings that you have in your literature review. Or even when you write up your findings in qualitative research. So the headings need to be logical. But the next thing, and this I often find with students just starting or even further along the line, after your heading, the content that follows your heading needs to speak to the heading. I can't tell you how many times I find a heading and then the contents under the heading doesn't speak to the heading. I often also find it when students write up their methodology chapter that they would have a heading that says design, and then they talk about data collection under the design heading. Now, similarly, in your literature review, I often find that the student doesn't stick to the logical coherence of what the heading is. So make sure that your headings are logically congruent and that they follow in a logical form, but then also that your the writing underneath your headings have a logical structure and a logical flow. So I always say when academic writing is no one's first language. We often say that, oh, but you're English speaking and it's easier for you to write. And I have a counter argument to say that scientific writing is nobody's first language. We all needed to write, learn to write scientifically, learn to write coherently, learn to write in a systematic, logical, fluent manner. So I think a bit later on I might do a workshop again on writing, or somebody else might, but it's always worth reading how to write. and practice that. So the more you write, the better you get at it. It's just one of those things that the more you do it, the better you get at it. You don't get good at writing by reading. You need to read in order to write, but you have to, at some stage, sit down and write. Whether you do free flow writing, I often, when I have a writer's block, I'll just sit in front of my computer for 5 or 10 minutes and I write anything that comes to mind. And so I have a file that's just writer's block. I write anything. Sometimes I might use it for an article. But it's often useful to get you started in writing if you feel that you're a bit congested or you don't quite now know how to continue. So I wanted, we've spoken a lot about critical thinking and how it fits in with arguments and higher order thinking skills. So I'm just going to spend a minute or two just to take you through what we mean by higher order thinking skills and arguments and writing these. Just give me a minute. I just quickly want to have a sip of water, otherwise I might start coughing. Okay, so we're talking about Bloom's taxonomy, and typically Bloom's taxonomy would be our higher order thinking skills. So Bloom's taxonomy, if any of you know Bloom has a hierarchy of higher order thinking skills. He says right at the bottom, the easiest skill is to remember when we recall facts and basic concepts. Now, when we simply write our literature review and just give facts, that's the lowest level of thinking. When we start to explain concepts or ideas, or we discuss, then we start to understand, and that's a level of higher thinking. When we start applying the information in new situations, or we start interpreting, or for instance, using new concepts and apply these concepts, that's another level of thinking. When we start analyzing and synthesizing and drawing connections amongst ideas, when we compare and contrast, remember just now we said what we aim for is to compare and contrast research findings. When we start to distinguish and examine and test ideas, that's already on the third highest thinking space. When we start to evaluate, we start making decisions, we appraise, we argue, we defend, we support, we critique. That's on our second highest thinking level. And then when we create, we find that is our highest thinking level. This is where we design, for instance, new programs, we design new frameworks, we develop, for instance, new programs, or we develop new frameworks. That would be on the highest thinking skills. So in the same way, our writing also goes up in levels. So when we simply describe, when we just have, we just report on events or actions, this is on a very descriptive level, the most basic level. When we start to have a more expository writing, we start explaining concepts, we interpret and abstract concepts, we explain simple ideas by offering reports, then our level of thinking and arguing goes up. our second highest level of thinking and writing is when we start writing persuasively. When we have propositions, we make statements, we take a position, we evaluate other writers' positions, discourses or arguments or stylistic choices. That's when we are starting to evaluate. And then when we start creatively writing, that we start synthesizing information and create original arguments or creative work, we are at the highest level of Bloom's taxonomy. So as our thinking, our higher order thinking starts to develop from the bottom to the top, so our writing also develops from a very descriptive to exploratory to persuasive and then to scholarly or creative writing. So I hope that also shows you how your writing can develop as you get involved with your literature review. So we often say we write for knowledge. So if the writer presents information from a source text so that the reader can understand and comprehend, for instance, definitions, summaries, tables, and diagrams, we are working on a knowledge level. When we start working on a comprehensive level, one level up, that's when we start to translate, interpret meaning, explaining the relevance of sources, you interpret the significance. This is when you go one level up, and that is in comprehension. So when we start paraphrasing, when we interpret to help the reader understand, we are moving one level up and we are at the level of comprehension. Now, ideally, remember we said when we are at the level of application, that's when we show the reader how the knowledge has been used over time. So, for instance, if you describe a concept, explain why the concept is essential to your study, for example, where it's been used in different studies, you are working on an application level. When we're working on an analysis level, we're breaking a concept or data in parts. We explain the parts and then, very importantly, the relationship between them, looking across text, comparing, contrasting, grouping, and classifying. So here's an example. When you analyze, you would, for instance, say Jones 2022 shows 3 components that are critical to A, B, and C. Lamini, however, it identifies 5 additional details where Dory only mentions 2. And that would be a comparing and contrasting, and one way of writing up once you've analyzed. Then synthesize is a level higher, taking your findings and putting them back and get together again. That's your omelette. Although the literature shows that this concept has 3 essential characteristics, these characteristics are shaped by economic whatever. Now you put them together and you link to bring new insights. That's on a synthesis level. And then the very top level is when you evaluate, where your judgment is situated. Now that I've done this study, I have evaluated what is missing. Logic, you can use your logic and your reasoning. You show limitations and you show your scholarly performance. So there's just a few different ways to help you understand that when we do a literature review, we also work between knowledge domains. And Bloom was one example. This is just another example, and some examples within this where you would find these different levels of thinking. And so it goes kind of without question that on a master's level, you might reach a certain competence level. And that's good enough for a master's level. But when you're writing a doctoral thesis in a literature review, for instance, in a doctoral thesis, then definitely there's a higher expectation of you, and that you will definitely need to demonstrate that you have gone and that you use constantly, all levels of thinking, and definitely get up to an evaluation aspect that would suit the quality and the rigor of a doctoral thesis. So you can always strive towards this in your master's study, but usually I would be quite happy if you arrive at the analysis and the interpretation stage. That would be fine, but you can also reach these stages, but it's usually a progression. We usually start at the very basic level, and as we read more, as we write more, we find that we also evolve in our writing. And the simple reason for that is that we evolve in our thinking. So as our thinking evolves, so our writing evolves. So thinking, writing, reading all go together. So again, we go back to assessing the quality of the literature review. We can ask ourselves, does it have depth? Is it rigorous? Is it replicable? And is it useful? Both practical and theoretical contributions, for instance, for a PhD. So you can ask yourself when you evaluate your own literature review, have I gone deep enough? Have I rigorously done my literature review? Did I use quality sources? Did I use quality journals? Did I use key authors? Do I know who's the thought leaders in my field? When we talk about replicability, that's when you have an audit trial. Did I tell the reader what search engines I used, what keywords did I use, and what combinations did I use, so that they can replicate if they would have wanted to? And if you can answer yes to all of these, you're well on your way to having a quality literature review. So if you want to publish your literature review, that's often the very first article that you possibly can identify as writing an article about. If you are students that registered with UNISA from 2020 onwards, you must please remember that on a master's study, you need to, before you graduate, you need to have submitted one article to a journal. On a PhD level, you need to have submitted 2 articles to journals. So that is a requirement. So the sooner you start thinking about or identifying what aspects of your research could be potential articles, your literature review, if done well, could potentially be your first article. So when we want to publish a literature review, we must be able to identify what is new, what's noteworthy, and what is different. And that actually goes for any article that you want to publish. I always say, so what? And I don't mean to be belittling about it, but if you can't tell me the so what is new, so what is noteworthy, so what is different, I'm really not interested in reading it. You must be able to say what the contribution is upfront. If you don't have a contribution, then don't bother trying to get it published. Very important. Then, example, you can create a timeline for analyzing or predicting where the field is heading. So your literature review could possibly have this format, creating a timeline and predicting where the field is heading. That would be an amazing article. Or you can do a comparison of different related terms or construct that can serve as a basis for theory development. You can identify actual knowledge gap and previous research. and start conceptualizing those and potentially putting it out there. So very important, a literature review, especially if you've done a scoping review. Journals are now quite interested in scoping reviews. They are arguing that there is so much replication in knowledge that it's worthwhile to know what is the scope of the knowledge in a discipline or within a phenomena, and then from there on to establish what you can add, and not just keep on redoing the same thing. So there's a great scope for publishing scoping reviews, systematic reviews, integrated reviews. So that, as I said, could be a potential first article for you if you do it well from the beginning. And then we talked last night to find a home for your publishing. If you've now already, during your scoping review, identified top journals, then you've already familiarized yourself with the journal. You know what they publish. You're already using the authors publishing in this journal, and you're right there at it where you can put in your contribution in those journals that you actually used in your review. You could, as I said, you can do your literature reviews as articles, and many journals are open to conceptual articles. So conceptual article means that you conceptualized a study, and you've applied concepts, for instance, to practice or through a unique framework, and your contribution lies in that. So just an example, when you look at a journal, when you look at the journal scope, and they will usually tell you what forms of articles they are looking for. So for instance, in the Higher Education Research and Development Journal, informs and challenges researchers, teachers, administrators, policymakers, and other concerned with past, present, and future of higher education. So you can already think, if your study is situated within higher education, it could be anyone in higher education, as I said, researchers, teachers, administrators, policymakers. So if you've got an article that addresses any of these within higher education, this might be a good fit. And then they tell you the journal publishes scholarly articles that make a significant or original contribution to the field of higher education. And that's what I was saying in terms of your so what. Now, very important, they tell you what type of articles they look at. So they'll look at empirical articles where you've done research, but have a look here. They say that they also publish theoretical articles. So if you have a conceptual article or you've got a systematic or integrative review, you can find a home here. So they also publish philosophical and historical articles that address higher education and many of its research that interrogates challenges and reflect on pressing issues in higher education. They also like articles that draw on a range of theoretical and methodological frameworks. So if you have a unique methodology, this might also be a place for you to publish your articles. But they tell you that all articles must propose a fresh critical insight into the area being addressed and be appropriately framed for an international audience. I so often find students being satisfied with, I don't want to say with the least. I don't know if it's just something about our South Africans that we're just so grateful that we can publish in sometimes very well, let's say lower quality journals, because the pressure to publish or perish is just so great. We kind of take anything. But if we already frame our research from the beginning for an international audience, so your study might take place in South Africa. But if you want to write, for instance, for higher education research and development, you need to frame your article for an international audience. So you would need to, in your article, explain what is the relevance of your research for an international audience. Because remember, the readers of this journal is an international audience. So from the beginning, pitch high. I always say, and this is something I want to tell you. I've got quite a bit of experience of publishing in higher ranking journals, and what I find is they've got a much higher developmental approach. They give very, very, very thorough feedback. They are much more kinder. They really want to help you to develop. They give excellent feedback. They give excellent ideas, and you can really, really grow through the process. Where I often find that the South African journals and reviewers are sometimes very harsh, very unkind. They don't see it as a developmental approach. So I can really encourage you, if you want to publish, don't be scared of the higher impact journals. If you've done good work, pitch yourself with top tier journals. It will help you all along your journey. So don't settle for less. You are worth more, and you are definitely, if you do rigorous and thorough work, you can pitch yourself with the best of them. And then, so we ask authors to review former issues of this journal, and where possible, engage with previous published articles as part of your preparation manuscript for submission to them. So what they do here is that they actually ask you to use articles from their journal. And so if you've done it from the beginning, you've identified this journal as one of your top journals, then you've already, your work used this journal as references, and you already comply with this requirement. So that's just an example. If you want to publish your conceptual or theoretical work or your literature review, that have a look at the scope of journals, and then they will usually tell you whether they accept, for instance, these types of journal articles. So just a few common problems, and then I think we are done with my talking for the evening. Some common problems, and I think you might have realized this by our sessions by now, is that you will you will experience problems if you over rely on low quality sources. It will catch up to you. If your literature review or your writing lacks landmark or seminal literature, remember last night we said we stand on the shoulders of giants, and we might not always need to have reams and reams of writing in doing justice to them, but at the very least will you nod in their direction so that the reader or the examiner knows that you know about the seminal work that informs your study. Definitely a problem is a lack of current literature, and we've spoken about that extensively. Lack of transparency. If you don't give the reader or the examiner the ability to have an audit trail, or you don't leave an audit trail, then there's a problem with transparency, and they might also not look very kindly on that. Please be careful for selection bias. So, for instance, I'm going to be very upstream now. For instance, if you are a gentleman and you only cite male authors, for instance, that's the very random example of bias, but there could be other biases as well. So keep a tab on yourself and for potential biases. Please be careful of description instead of integration and synthesis, and that goes to your higher order thinking. Very important, irrelevant or unfocused content. Please make sure that your content is focused, and I've given you some ideas how to achieve that. Poor chapter structure and layout, that speaks to the coherency and flow of your literature review. Make sure that there's a logical structure and that there's also a internal congruence with what you write under your headings. Plagiarism and poor referencing. Students, I can't emphasize this enough, that from the very beginning, you have a referencing tool. In this day and age, you can't go about and get around a manual referencing system. It wastes an incredible amount of time. I just reviewed an article that one of my PhD students sent me yesterday. She's been on a writing retreat and she's written an article out of her PhD, and she sent the article to me with the journal guidelines and said that, I don't know who was the evaluator, but someone in the writing retreat said that the article is good to go and ready to be submitted. And I opened it and I realized that it's nowhere near. So part of what had me working at 3 this morning is that it took me 12 hours. I worked from 3 this morning to 3 this afternoon to try and correct the layout, and the referencing was a mess. She had done a manual referencing. She did not use the referencing technique that the journal requires, so all of the references needed to be fixed by hand. It took hours. Please don't do it to yourself. I often have students running into problems when they're ready to submit their thesis or their dissertation, and they have it edited and the editor picks up the one after the other query on their references. So please use a referencing tool that imports the information. Please check that the information is imported correctly. And then you shouldn't have a problem with your references. They'll be correct, they'll be complete. You can, if you are using a referencing tool, you can change the referencing style. So please, no hand referencing. We passed that era. You can work smarter and spend your time on other things. And then the last thing is poor academic writing. And by that, I really don't mean to scare you. And that's why I emphasize that scholarly writing is no one's first language. We learn, and you learn every day. I still learn. But so please don't get disheartened. The more you do it, the better you'll get at it. And indeed, as I said, that is our presentation for tonight. I just want to see if I can increase my screen and stop sharing. Yes, and then if you'll just give me a moment to just open up the Q&A session. It might just take a moment or two to load on my side. And then we can engage in some conversations. Okay, all right, Michelle, so you actually did the homework. Well done, and you've done excellent. I could not find the exact title, but I did find social media use and its impact on adolescent mental health, an umbrella review for evidence. Perfect. You identified the authors and that journal. You were able to identify this as a Q1 journal, so it's a good resource. Excellent. You found all the flaws. Well done. You were able to use the SkyMago site, and you were able to identify that indeed this is a good journal in which they were published, but it wasn't the right title, and there was some information missing. You did very, very well. Manil, Mohan, excellent session, so much direction and information. It will make my next drafts to be better and have an easy flow. I am so very happy that you found it useful and that you'll be able to improve your drafts. Okay, and just from Marcel, thank you so much for 2 wonderful sessions. They were informative and helpful. I'm currently busy with my literature review in my research proposal and wanted to know how detailed, sorry, I just now skipped to another one, how detailed this should be. The entire research proposal is 30 pages. What proportion should be the literature review? How does this literature review differ from a literature review chapter in the final thesis? A very good question, Marcel. So if your entire proposal, which includes all your references often, is 30 pages, you are probably looking at around 5,000 words. So I normally say that your literature review, so this is a really a wide rule of thumb, probably around 750 to maybe 1,000 words of the 5,000. So the difference of your literature review in your proposal is that it doesn't need to be that extensive. You need to have enough literature to write your background, to write your problem statement, and to justify your research, so that you can identify, for instance, the gap for your thesis. And then you will use your literature to define your key concepts or possibly variables. So you will have literature scattered throughout your proposal, but there will also be a section for your literature review. And in this section, if we talk about 1,000 words, possibly about 4 pages. I don't think you really need that much, but you need to just show the reviewers, the scientific committee, that you have engaged with literature. You've got a more or less a broad understanding of what's going on in the field, but in your actual literature review chapter, you will go into in much more focused and in more depth. So we don't require in a proposal that much depth. And please be reminded, so watch your page limit, and you might find that, you know, if you've done 4 or 5 pages literature, carry on with the rest of the proposal and then check again, do you maybe have a few pages left, can you add, or are you over your page limit? But please stay within the page limit. They are getting very strict about the page limits, because the reviewers simply just have so much to read. But a very good question, so I hope I've answered your question in terms of that, Marcel. It's about the focus and the depth. That's the difference. And the pages you have in your literature review chapter, you have 30 pages just to write your literature review, where in your proposal you have 30 pages for your entire proposal. So you can imagine that the depth will then differ. Okay, so I'm really grateful for your participation, Marcel, and for your engagement. Well done. You will take it far. Also, Manil, for your feedback, thank you very much. It says in these type of sessions where I don't have direct contact, and you know, I can't chat to you through the presentations, it's always helpful to know whether you are pitching it right and whether it's helpful. All right, so Danae, I don't see any more questions. I just want to see if I refresh it. if anything more comes up, but currently there's only 3. So I'm a bit worried about the other 32 people attending. Any other questions that you might have, burning issues? Or possibly you're so overwhelmed now that you just need a break for your brain to absorb everything and put it into practice. But at least I hope that you have some ideas where to start, or some ideas where to refine your work, or to check quality issues, and to start preparing for a rigorous, critical literature review that will make your examiner or your supervisor enjoy reading it. So I always say, because the literature review is sometimes so boring for me, I want to be able to have a glass of red wine. Remember, I'm in Cape Town, so I want to sit down with a glass of red wine and enjoy your literature review. So don't make it difficult for me. Remember the storyline and take me with on your story and tell me about the story of your literature. All right, so from me then, we are finished a bit earlier. Please enjoy your evening. Yeah, there's some more questions. Oh, now they're coming, just as I was about to say goodbye. Okay, how do you structure the literature review write-up? Do we sing? That would depend on the type of literature review that you do. If it's a traditional literature review, you will structure it when you have identified certain themes that start to develop as you read, constructs that you maybe have identified. If you are doing a historical timeline, the timeline might guide you. But if you read, for instance, good textbooks like Research at Grassroots, there's many ways to write up your literature review. So there isn't just one way, there's many ways, and it depends on your literature, it depends on the question that you want to answer with your literature review. So your write-up must speak to the purpose of your literature review and the questions that you asked. But what is very important in terms of the structure is that it's logical and that it's congruent. I hope that helps. Then anonymous could accepted databases like Scopus, Web of Science, etc. also have papers which are low quality that can never negatively affect the review. Indeed, you are quite right. It doesn't matter that, or it doesn't mean that if something is published, it's necessarily good. So very wise question there. And that's why you always evaluate critically evaluate the article. So you evaluate, I mean, it's less likely that there's a poor article in a tier Q1 journal. Less likely, but it could happen. It could possibly happen. And therefore, part of your criticality is that you critically look at the quality of the article. Do they have statements? Do they back up their statements with evidence? Do they reach a conclusion based on the evidence? Is there evidence? Is there bias? Is the findings, are the findings related to the methodology? Was that done rigorously? Was a rigorous research literature review done? So definitely it could happen that you have poor quality articles that are still published. Less so with higher ranking journals, but I'm not saying that it can't happen, it can. So your criticality also starts with that review as well. Yeah, anonymous. Yeah, so the presentation will be sent to you. Dineo already gave you the link, so the link would contain the presentations of both evenings. I haven't added, I may have shifted around from last night, but the slide contents are the same that you received last night. Oh, was available since last night. Okay, then we seem to be at the end. All right, then I'm going to say a hearty goodbye and a good evening. Enjoy your evening, enjoy your weekend if you're not working on your literature review. Take care until we meet again. Bye-bye.